Our first type of cellular transport is diffusion. Remember, we're going to define each type of cell transport based on three choices: up versus down, active versus passive, and mediated versus non-mediated. In the case of diffusion, the choices are down, passive, and non-mediated. Remember, down means the movement of solute particles from an area of high concentration towards an area of low concentration. So if you look at the example here, you've got a cell membrane, our barrier, our selectively permeable barrier. We have an area of high concentration on one side, and we have an area of low concentration on the other. And in a sort of time-lapse way, as you move across from left to right, you can see those particles are moving down. Not physically down on the screen, that just happens to be the case here, but from an area of higher towards an area of lower concentration, until, by the third frame here, you have what is referred to as equilibrium. You have an equal concentration of solute particles on both sides of the cell membrane. That doesn't mean that these particles then stop moving, but for every particle, say this one, that would move across the cell membrane in this direction, there's a chance, a greater likelihood, that there's probably going to be one over here that also moves in the opposite direction. So equality has been reached. Remember, it's passive, meaning there is no reference here to any energy. These particles had enough energy on their own to cross the cell membrane, and your body did not have to supply any of it. Diffusion is non-mediated, which means all you're seeing here is the phospholipid bilayer. You're not seeing any of those carrier molecule proteins that would help a particle move from one side to the other. So diffusion is down, passive, and non-mediated. An example of diffusion would be occurring within the lungs and the bloodstream that runs through those lungs. If you look at the picture here, you can see an example or a representation of your lungs. And you can see two gases that occupy your lungs, both oxygen and carbon dioxide. You can see that there is a greater concentration of oxygen in the lungs in comparison to this blood. Here is a blood vessel, and you would refer to this as blue blood, or used up blood that's coming back to the heart and then to the lungs, and it is filled with carbon dioxide. So they have an area of high concentration of carbon dioxide here in the blood, an area of low concentration of carbon dioxide in the lungs, an area of high concentration of oxygen in the lungs, but low within the bloodstream. In other words, CO2 is going to diffuse from the blood into the lungs at the same time that oxygen is going to diffuse from the lungs into the blood. And that's referred to as gas exchange, and it operates under the premise of diffusion. If we look further along this blood vessel here, you eventually get to the tissues of the body. The reason your blood fills itself with oxygen is in order to deliver that oxygen to tissues of the body. You can see that there is a high concentration of oxygen, and of course there's a high concentration of carbon dioxide in the tissues. And so oxygen diffuses from the blood into the tissues, and carbon dioxide diffuses from the tissues into the blood. There is a specialized version of diffusion referred to as osmosis, which is simply the movement of water molecules. Now keep in mind, up to this point we have solely focused on the solute and the movement of those solute particles across cell membranes either into or out of the cell. But in this case we're instead, in talking about water, going to deal with the solvent. If you look at this diagram, you again see a dotted or dashed line going down the middle of it, which I want to represent a cell membrane. You can see the large green dots on the left, which represent a solute, but look at the smaller blue dots, which represent water, and therefore the solvent. You can see that there are fewer solute particles. It is less concentrated on the left side when compared to the right. There are two terms which you absolutely positively have to know when it comes to your association with osmosis. Those terms are hypotonic and hypertonic. Hypo is a prefix that basically means less. So in this side of the cell membrane, there is less solute. There's a less concentration or lower concentration of solute. Hyper means more, and so on this side of the cell membrane, there is a greater concentration of solute. And if you think about what we just talked about in terms of diffusion, you would think about these solute particles moving from the right side to the left side, which is certainly a possibility in order to help reach equilibrium. But what also could move instead of that solute would be the solvent of water. And so this arrow here really represents the movement of water particles. So the water from the left side would move to the right. Think about what would happen as a result. Over here, we could keep the same number of solute particles, but if more water enters this area from the left side, it will dilute the solute concentration over here on the right, thus lowering its concentration. And as that water leaves the left side, even if we just keep these same 4 solute particles over here, as the solvent or water leaves, the concentration on the hypotonic side will start to rise. And so as the concentration on the left rises and the concentration on the right starts to fall, eventually, same as before, equilibrium will be achieved. Those same ideas are represented here. If you look at this picture on the left, this is supposed to be a cell, the orange color. This is supposed to be the solution surrounding a cell. And because there's just a little bit of solute over here, we're going to refer to this as the hypotonic solution. Because there is a greater concentration on the inside of the cell, that's the hypertonic solution. And although water can move in both directions, more water will move inward. That's why I have the bigger arrow here. Yes, some water molecules could sneak out. It's not that that can't happen, but more water will move in. There will be a net flow of water in, because water is always going to flow from hypotonic towards the hypertonic solution. If we look at the flip side of that, over here on the far right, we have a hypotonic solution on the inside. We have a hypertonic solution outside this cell. And so the net flow of water will be outward. This concentration outside will start to drop as a result of more water coming to that area. The concentration on the inside will start to rise, and again, equilibrium will be achieved. The one piece of terminology that we haven't used yet would be the term isotonic. And my guess is by looking at this picture, you could probably guess what isotonic means. It means that equilibrium has already been achieved. Yes, there will be some water flowing into this cell from the outside, but there should be an equal amount of water from the inside flowing out. So the concentrations being equal inside and out would be an isotonic solution. If we look at this in just a slightly different way, you can see an animal cell being represented across the top and a plant cell being represented across the bottom. If you would put an animal cell into a solution that is hypotonic, in other words, hypo on the outside, hyper on the inside, water will flow in, because it will always flow from hypo to hyper. And it's possible with an animal cell that so much water could flow in that the cell could pop. And the term for that is that it could lyse. What we want in our bodies at all times is to have this equilibrium that is taking place here. In other words, really, we have homeostasis. We have an equal amount of water flowing in, we have an equal amount of water flowing out, because we have an isotonic solution inside and out. Finally, on the far right, we have a cell that is being surrounded by a hypertonic solution. So hypo on the inside, hyper on the outside, water will flow out. And again, if this is an extreme situation and enough water flows out, that cell could also die, not because it swells and pops, but because it shrivels and dies. Plants, represented down here on the bottom, are a little bit different in that what is actually normal is that plant cells want more water flowing in. That's possible because a plant cell will not pop due to the fact that it has a strong, rigid, tough cell wall on the outside, which animal cells lack. Here we have an equal amount of water flowing in and out, and on the far right you have what is called a plasmolized situation, where you have more water flowing out. You can see the cell membrane here actually pulling away from the cell wall as that cell sort of shrivels up. And of course, plants can't do so well without a decent amount of water. Sorry about that. Finally, our last version of passive transport would be something called facilitated diffusion. You can see, as defined here on the left side, facilitated diffusion is down, like diffusion. It's passive, like diffusion, but there has to be something different, and the something is that it is mediated. So we can see we have particles here in high concentration. We have solute particles here in low concentration, and so they're going to move from where it's high towards where it's low. They're going to do so without the addition of any extra energy from your body, but they are going to need the help of some sort of transport system. So you've got a carrier molecule being represented here, a large chunky protein in the midst of that cell membrane that basically gobbles up one of these particles on one side, changes shape, and then you can see here in step number 3, spits it out on the opposite side. So facilitated diffusion is down, passive, both like diffusion, but unlike diffusion is mediated instead of non-mediated.